Morning rose over London like a curtain of mist, hesitant to reveal the scene. The air vibrated with a soft, almost golden energy, where tourists mingled with hurried figures amidst the murmurs of a city still half awake. All around the gates of Buckingham Palace, one could hear the clicking of cameras, the whispers of families huddling together, the laughter of children fascinated by the red uniforms of the guards who never flinched. It was a perfect painting, too perfect, as if something was waiting for its moment to crack the tranquility. A group of visitors had gathered along the barrier. Among them was a stocky man with a weary smile, his glasses slightly askew, a Scottish cap pulled low over his eyes. He seemed out of breath, as if he had been running to catch up with the parade. In his left hand, a blue leash, taut and twitching with anticipation. At the end of the leash, an English bulldog. Massive, tanned by the sun, its eyes so round they looked like marbles about to fall. The animal was pulling, growling slightly, and moving its rear end as if it were preparing to go on stage. The handler tried to regain control, puffing, pulling, apologizing to those he jostled, but the crowd involuntarily pushed him forward, toward the very heart of the tension. Murmurs began to rise. Some smiled at the animal's clumsy affection. Others frowned nervously, because here everyone knows the royal guard never jokes around. Military music began to throb through the air. A drum roll shook the gates. Black boots appeared in the distance, striking the ground with mechanical precision, perfect cadence. A choreography that nothing interrupts, nothing. Or almost. The bulldog raised his head, his ears twitching. He sniffed the air with a newfound excitement, as if he had detected something unique. His gaze settled on the approaching column of guards. The rhythm, the noise, the smell, this entire military symphony awakened something in his instinct. He fired. Again. Stronger. The owner tried to hold onto the leash, but his fingers slipped. A movement that was too quick, too clumsy. The metal buckle clinked against his palm. Then the sound occurred. Dry. Unexpected. Final. Clack. The leash came loose. A breath swept through the crowd. An invisible wave. Some saw it, others didn't, but all felt that a balance had just been shattered. The bulldog took off. A beige glint amidst human legs. A thunder of paws on the cobblestones. An enthusiastic, free, unrestrained breath. "No! No! No!" cried the master, his voice torn by panic. But it was too late. The animal was charging straight towards the guards. The phones went up. The tourists turned around. The murmurs transformed into stifled exclamations. The scene unfolded in slow motion. A dog running towards a unit whose sacred rule is absolute immobility. A century-old protocol clashing with the unpredictable. Order versus chaos. Discipline versus instinct. The guards advanced further, perfect lines, gazes fixed on the horizon, no emotion, no reaction, as if the world around them didn't exist. As if the bulldog were just another breath of air. But for the crowd, every inch they drew closer sent a surge of tension. The dog came within a few meters. Then at 1 meter. Then a few centimeters from the impeccable boots of the first guard. And then he stopped abruptly. He raised his head. His eyes met the guard's motionless face. A silent, improbable exchange, as if they both knew they had just entered a zone where nothing should ever happen. The master arrived behind, stumbling, trying to call his dog in a low voice so as not to trigger a sudden reaction. The crowd held its breath. Some had their hands over their mouths. Others smiled nervously. Nobody knew what would happen next. The air became heavier, denser, more electric. Because at that precise moment, a mundane event, a dog running away, had just become a scene from a movie. A scene where every gesture, every breath mattered. Where the slightest reaction from the guard could change the course of what would become, a few minutes later, a story no one would forget. The bulldog sniffed a boot. The guard remained motionless. The world held its breath. And somewhere beyond the gate, the military music continued, as if nothing had just begun. There is a symmetry in the lives of the royal guards that few professions require. An inner architecture made of repetitive cycles, of repeated gestures, of thoughts contained within a box too narrow for the unexpected. One might think it's all simple. Stand tall, keep silent, protect what must be protected. But the truth is more subtle. Like a clock ticking behind their ribs, a clock no one sees, but each wears with almost religious devotion. Every morning, even before the crowd presses against the gates, the ritual begins. A meticulous, almost sacred uniform check. The weight of the rifle on the shoulder, which becomes an extension of the body. The bearskin helmet, imposing, crushing, heavy, like an invisible crown. And then the formation, the rhythm, the steps aligned in unison, like a collective breath that unfolds and then folds back in precise, measured motion. London awakens around them like a roaring sea, a whirlwind of ringtones, horns, and shouts that cut through the air without ever truly reaching them. The guards move amidst this commotion without fully belonging to it, like figures carved from another era. With each changing of the guard, it's the same scene, the same looks of wonder, the same raised cameras, the same emerging whispers. An endless loop where order seems indestructible. And yet, yet, some cracks, invisible to tourists, exist in this overly perfect system. That morning, a guard in the second row felt an unusual tension in his shoulder, a sharp pain, like a metal wire stretched too tight. He didn't flinch. He couldn't. Discipline demanded that nothing show, but the sensation persisted, like a silent warning he tried to ignore. A few steps away, another guard had slept poorly. An old memory, surfacing unexpectedly, had troubled his mind as he donned his uniform. The death of his grandfather, also a former soldier. His recent absence filled his heart with a melancholy he wasn't allowed to show. The uniform doesn't just cover the body, it seals the emotions inside. Perhaps this is the first crack. The awareness that behind this impeccable, by definition human, facade, something is tense, contracting, preparing to give way if a single grain of sand were to disrupt the mechanism. A few meters away, in the dense crowd, the steady beat of drums resonated through the railings like the city's pulse. People stirred, rising onto tiptoe, lifting their children to show them the flamboyant uniforms, the marching musicians, the perfect movements of the parade. Routine is reassuring. It gives the impression of a world that functions, of an eternal order that nothing can disrupt. But all order, however solid it may be, always depends on a fragile balance. The Bulldog had just shattered the hypnotic calm, but most of the tourists still didn't understand the effect. They didn't see the subtle reactions, the minute tensions within the ranks. They didn't know that protocol, for these men in red, is a sacred pillar, a safeguard that protects them as much as it confines them. In the guard's mind, facing the dog, another crack was appearing. He repeated to himself, rule number 1, remain motionless, no matter what. He remembered his instructors, their sharp voices that struck his eardrums like sword blows. No movement, not a muscle. The uniform before the man, a phrase that had forged his mind like one forges a blade. And yet, humanity never completely disappears beneath layers of discipline. He could see the dog's breathing, rapid and ragged. He could hear its small, joyful, almost childlike grunt. He could sense the panicked owner behind the barrier, terror in his eyes, the fear of an incident, a scandal, the worst. Emotions that the guard, for his part, wasn't allowed to show. Not even a shadow, not even a glimmer. The routine was slowly beginning to lose its balance, like a large ship that barely rocks, but enough for the crew to realize that something has changed. A tremor, imperceptible to the outside world, but growing within the motionless figures. The drums continued in an implacable rhythm. The crowd murmured, captivated by this small element that had just drifted out of the script. And in the midst of all that, the guard smelled something. A strange, almost gentle warmth slowly enveloped him, as if the universe were whispering to him that perhaps routine was not an insurmountable wall, but a curtain ready to open. The Bulldog looked up again, and the crack grew larger. It must have been made of stone. That's what we expected from him. A living statue. A fortress with a human face. Something unshakable, cold, perfectly controlled. It was often said that the royal guards had no heart. We looked at them as we would look at a machine whose precision we admire. We forgot that under the red tunic, under the bearskin, and under the motionless rifle, there was a human being who breathed, who doubted, who remembered. The guard stared at the horizon, but inside, everything began to vibrate. The Bulldog was still in front of him, motionless now, sitting like a punished child, but with that disarming innocence that made things waver. A dog has no protocol. A dog only knows the present moment. The guard, for his part, knew the weight of protocol like the weight of armor. The crowd was bustling around, not noisy, not violent, but human. A tide of breaths, whispers, and glances fixed upon him. Phones held aloft, trembling with excitement or worry. Each spectator remembered something. A laugh, a gasp, a moment of concern. Everyone was waiting for a reaction. But he couldn't react. He shouldn't have. Yet, his heart was pounding hard. Too strong for a man who was supposed to feel nothing. Each beat made the rifle resting against his shoulder vibrate. Each breath became a struggle against his own body. He tried to bring his mind back to discipline. At training, to the shouts of the instructors in the field, "You don't move even if the world collapses around you." That phrase had shaped him, engraved in his muscles, in his bones. But the world was not collapsing. He was transforming. And it wasn't a threat rushing towards him. It wasn't a danger. He was not a provocateur. It was a bulldog, a round, tender, breathless, clumsy being. A being who understood nothing of military order or the solemnity of the moment. A being who breathed simply with all the sincerity of life. And that's what shook the guard. Not fear, not the protocol. The contrast. Because in that contrast, a fissure opened in his mind like a fracture of light. The outside world demanded that he be made of stone, but the scene before him reminded him that he had a heart. He tried to ignore it. He tried to straighten up even more, to hold the line like a marble pillar. The dog inclined his head. A gentle, almost questioning, almost affectionate inclination. A silent gesture, but one heavy with meaning. This simple inclination brought back a memory. His own dog, years earlier. An English shepherd, spotted, cheerful, always ready to pounce on him when he came home after long silent days. He remembered her weight against his legs, her eyes filled with unconditional loyalty. He remembered the simple warmth, the raw comfort that only an animal can offer. This memory surfaced so suddenly that he had to fight to keep from breathing too heavily. The uniform even prohibits overly visible emotions. His solar plexus contracted as if time itself had paused. The crowd saw nothing, or rather, she saw what she thought she saw, a guard. A man frozen, impassive. A statue, but inside, it was a battlefield. A silent conflict. The dog straightened up slightly, moved closer by 1 centimeter, then another. Not a threat, not a sudden movement. Just a tentative step forward, as if he were trying to understand the other side of that rigid uniform. The guard felt a strange pulsation in his fingers, a spasm that he immediately suppressed. Her body wanted to move. His instinct wanted to respond. His heart wanted to reach out. That's when the escalation became almost unbearable. Because discipline is not just an external framework. It is an inner presence, an intimate adversary, a whispering voice. If you move, you betray your role. If you move, you're no longer a guard. If you move, you're just a man. And this voice now clashed with another voice. Softer, older, deeper. It's just a lost animal. And you know what it's like to be human. Between these two voices, the tension grew, coiled, tightened, like a rope stretched between two worlds. The world of stone and the world of flesh. The dog's owner pleaded loudly. "Biscuit, come here, come on." His panic pierced even the fog of protocol. It vibrated in the air like a dissonant note. But Biscuit wasn't listening. He stared at the guard as if something within him, something animalistic and pure, had perceived what the crowd did not see. This statue was not entirely a statue. This heart was not entirely made of stone. Something was breathing, something was moving, something wanted to be seen. And the rise in power continued. Inside the guard's head, in the dog's eyes, in the roar of the crowd, in the very air, which had become too heavy for a simple stage. Something was about to give way. Something had to give way. The question was no longer whether. The question was when the sound of heavy footsteps approached, slowly, measured, as if each step were weighed by an invisible ruler. He wasn't just anyone. He was an officer. His dark uniform contrasted sharply with the bright red of the guards. His mere presence seemed to push back the air. Each of the tourists around fell silent, turned around, and straightened up. as if order materialized all at once, embodied in this man with stern shoulders. The Bulldog's owner, however, was trembling. Panic clung to him. He apologized in every language he knew, awkward English, hesitant French, hurried Spanish, but his words were lost in the muffled hubbub of the crowd. "Biscuit, Biscuit, come here, please," he repeated, his voice breaking. Biscuit still wasn't listening. The dog was still staring at the guard, intrigued, fascinated, drawn to this perfect stillness. The guard, however, did not move an inch, but inside, his tension rumbled like a storm that no one could see. The officer advanced. Close up, his closed face. Close up of his impeccable black gloves. Close up on his eyes as they analyzed the situation like a perfectly calibrated algorithm. Around them, tourists held their breath. Some people filmed it. Others lowered their phones, suddenly aware of the silent gravity of the moment. The murmur became a collective breath. The invisible order had just entered the scene. The officer positioned himself directly behind the guard. Her voice, when it rose, did not need to be loud. She had that tone that carries weight, that tone that commands obedience. Soldier. One word. Just one. But it carried more weight than an entire paragraph of the protocol. The guard felt the vibration of that voice slide down his spine. He was familiar with that stamp. It wasn't a reminder. It was a warning. Biscuit wagged his tail. A joyful, out-of-place beat. A gesture so innocent it seemed to tempt fate. The officer observed the animal as one would observe a mechanical malfunction. He narrowed his eyes slightly. No anger, no fear, just this cold, methodical, almost surgical analysis. "Get your animal back," he said to the tourist without taking his eyes off the guard. The master advanced hesitantly, as if entering forbidden territory. Her hands were trembling. He reached his fingers towards his dog's collar, but Biscuit dodged it. With one step, just a small step, one small step that jeopardized everything. The crowd gave a small exclamation. A wave of air, a muffled sound wave. The officer raised his hand slightly, controlled the movement. A gesture of absolute authority. "Back up," he ordered. The master obeyed immediately, his eyes shining with anguish. Her fingers tightened against her chest. He was afraid for his dog. But above all, he was afraid that he had triggered something that was completely beyond his control. The officer turned his attention back to the guard. Close up on the soldier's eyes, two still lakes, but crossed by an almost imperceptible flash. That gaze defied the invisible order. Or rather, he revealed that a silent confrontation had begun. "Procedure," the officer murmured. The word descended through the air like a sentence. Not a sound, not a threat, a single word, but it unleashed an overwhelming force. Procedure? The guard knew it by heart. Every gesture, every reaction, every second, he knew what he had to do. He knew what protocol required, but he didn't move. The crowd sensed this silent refusal. She sensed that something was happening there, something fragile and grand. A raw but invisible confrontation. Man against order. Empathy versus the rule. Life versus mechanics. Biscuit sat down again, directly in front of the guard. Eyes raised, drooping ears, perfect innocence. The officer observed the scene. His face hardened slightly. He understood? Yes. He understood that this was not just an incident. It was a dangerous friction. His gaze slid from the dog to the guard, then from the guard to the dog. Then it returned to the guard like a laser beam. The guard felt this pressure, this waiting period, this requirement. It was divided in two. Two worlds collided within him. The voice of protocol, cold and sharp. You obey, you are a pillar, you are the rule incarnate. And the voice of her humanity, gentle, tenacious, courageous. He's just a lost dog. And you see the fear in his eyes. You see his owner's panic. You see what others don't show. The tension rose again and again and again. It wrapped itself around him like an invisible rope. A rope he knew he had to break. Or respect. Total suspense. Suspended silence. The whole world seemed to be waiting to see which side would prevail. And in this silent battlefield, the invisible order continued to exert its influence. Heavy, inflexible, implacable. Silence. Not ordinary silence, no. A strange silence. Thick, heavy, like a blanket of fog. that falls over a vibrant landscape. A silence that did not come from the absence of sounds, but from the suspension of the world. The drums were still beating, somewhere far behind. The crowd breathed a sigh of relief. The planes were flying over London, but for those standing in front of Buckingham Palace, everything had just stopped. The guard felt the silence close in on him like the doors of a cathedral. Her heart was beating too fast. Too fast. Too human. The Bulldog, however, understood nothing of this invisible drama. He remained there, sitting, tongue hanging out, eyes wide, breath short, unaware that he had just become the center of an inner storm. The officer was waiting, motionless, but with a burning stillness, and that simple word procedure still echoed in the guard's head, not as an order, like an echo that refuses to die. For a fleeting moment, time unfolded in layers. The present, the memory, duty, the human, everything was superimposed in a play of sparkling mirrors. He relives his training. Sweat, the screams, sleepless nights, the exercises where we learn to erase the man to leave only the soldier. He also relived something else. On a worn kitchen floor, his first dog curled up against him, a puppy with oversized ears, lying in his arms, trembling on stormy days. He remembered how he used to hold him close, warm him, and reassure him. These two scenes, the relentless training and the gentleness of a trembling animal, suddenly overlapped in his mind like two misaligned slides. And then he felt something. A glance, biscuits. Not a look of fear. Not a single defiant look. A look of expectation. A silent plea. Tiny, but immense. The crowd too seemed suspended in that tiny space between a gesture and the absence of a gesture. Some were holding their breath. Others were biting their lips. A child, perched on his father's shoulders, opened his eyes wide in fascination. And the guard felt that pressure. Not just that of the officer. Not just that of the protocol. But that of the human gaze fixed upon him. A demonstration of order was expected from him. We were hoping for a demonstration of humanity from him. He was caught between two worlds that were pulling at each other until they almost tore him apart. Heffing as Tinglu, it was imperceptible. A micro discharge, an electrical impulse that traveled up his arm. The guard understood that it was no longer a matter of an order being given. It was a choice. Perhaps the most human, the most intimate choice he would have to make in his career. So, the world changed. Everything happened in an almost unreal slow motion. The hand, his hand, he went down. Very slowly. A tiny movement, a forbidden act, a gesture sacrificed on the altar of humanity. His glove first brushed against the air, then the dog's head. Warm fur, the slight vibration of the skull, rapid breathing. Biscuit closed his eyes. 1 second, just a second, as if he were savoring the most improbable contact in the world. The crowd, initially frozen, let out a wave. A collective breath. Not a sound, not a single clap. A breath of surprise, of wonder, deeply emotional. The guard felt his whole body relax by a millimeter. Not enough to break the posture, just enough to feel a weight lift. The officer remained motionless. His hard face seemed to waver for a fraction of a second. A hesitation, a doubt, an understanding too, perhaps? Because there was nothing insolent about that gesture. Nothing rebellious. Nothing provocative. There was just a man, a dog, a suspended moment where the rule was no longer a wall, but a veil. Biscuit's master, his hand over his mouth, felt his eyes begin to mist over. He didn't Dari move. He didn't even dare to breathe too heavily, for fear of breaking the moment. The guard withdrew his hand, gently, slowly, as if the contact had been a brief parenthesis outside of time. The tension did not disappear. She transformed. Its nature changed. It became something else, a breath shared between strangers. This gesture had just shattered the silence, but he had left behind something even stronger, an undeniable humanity, inexplicable, undeniable. And now that the line had been crossed, nothing would ever be exactly the same again. The moment that followed the contact between the guard's hand and the dog's head seemed to slip into another dimension. The crowd, still immersed in what they had just seen, didn't really speak. She was whispering, as if the words suddenly didn't dare to stand up. A footstep clattered on the cobblestones. Then another one. The officer stepped forward not abruptly, but with the calculated slowness of men who carry responsibility like a visible weight on their shoulders. His uniform resonated with authority. His face remained impassive, but his gaze searched, analyzed, judged. The guard remained upright. No flinching. No attempt was made to justify himself. His face remained smooth, locked behind that mask of obligation he had been taught to wear. But his heart was still pounding, a witness to an act that no rule had anticipated. The officer fell silent, a long silence, the kind of silence that, in the army, can be worth more than a speech. Guard, he finally said. Single syllable. Slow. To be precise, almost metallic. The crowd held its breath. A shiver ran through the first lines of tourists. Some leaned slightly forward, as if by getting an inch closer they could understand what was going to follow. The guard did not respond. Replying was forbidden. His role was to listen, never the defense. The officer observed Biscuit. The little dog stared at the man with the sword, its tail motionless, as if it understood that something was happening here, without knowing what. Then the officer's gaze slid towards the master. A man overwhelmed, ashamed, almost doubled over. He held his animal close to him, pressing it in his arms as if to protect it from an invisible judgment. Your dog must never be let loose here, the officer declared firmly. The man immediately agreed. 3 times. Too fast. Too nervously. I know, I'm sorry. I didn't see that he wasn't tied up anymore. It's my fault, really. His voice was trembling. It overflowed with sincerity. Even the most stern spectators sensed that fear had intruded upon his speech. The officer looked at him for another moment. Then, slowly, his features changed. The angles of her face softened. Just a little. A sign that only the most attentive could have perceived. He nodded. Only once. Don't let this happen again. It wasn't a threat. It was an injunction. Clear. Right. But measured. A wave of relief swept through the crowd. Then the officer turned to the guard. His eyes no longer had quite the same hardness. No smile. No approval. No order. Just one sentence. You will resume your position, guard. A simple order. Neutral. Strangely neutral. And it was precisely this neutrality that made something essential clear. There would be no public reprimand. No immediate sanctions. No example to set in front of tourists. The protocol was judging, but the human had just forgiven. The guard carried out the movement. Perfectly. With surgical precision. As if he wanted to honor every fiber of his uniform to balance what he had just accomplished. The crowd was still watching. She dared neither applaud nor comment. The moment existed in an intermediate zone between respect, admiration, and fragile awe. A child finally broke the silence. He asked his mother in a clear whisper, Mom, the guard, did he have the right to touch the dog? The mother hesitated. She observed the guard, upright and silent. The officer has now returned to his post. The crowd was still glistening with murmurs. I don't know, she replied softly, but I believe he did the right thing. His words floated in the air, free, almost philosophical. Biscuit's master, still shaken, bowed deeply towards the guard. A respectful, sincere, humble gesture. He received no reply because he could not receive one. But he didn't expect to return. What he had seen was enough for him. Biscuit, for his part, wagged his tail. Once, then 2. Before resting his head on his master's shoulder, like a child being brought home after an adventure too big for him, the crowd began to disperse. Slowly, in silence, like leaving a theater after a scene that still resonates with you. People were not speaking loudly. They were whispering. They recounted what they had seen, but with a strange respect, a restraint that only an event charged with humanity can provoke. The master, leaving the place, turned around one last time. The guard hadn't moved an inch, but he was there. Here, anchor, proud, and yet infinitely human. There was nothing more to add, nothing left to judge, nothing left to punish. The protocol had been observed. The human had understood, and something that day had quietly shifted towards compassion. There are moments in life that lasts only a second, but which leave a deeper impression than entire years. Tiny, suspended moments where the world suddenly seems to reveal something we didn't know yet. That day, in front of Buckingham Palace, it wasn't a protocol that had been broken. It was not a rule that had wavered. It wasn't even a line of authority that had been crossed. No, it was something else entirely. Something simpler, more fragile, and yet infinitely more precious. A reminder that, behind every uniform, there remains a beating heart. When the guard touched the little bulldog's head, he wasn't just petting a lost animal. He had reached out to something that protocol can neither measure, nor contain, nor prohibit. A part of himself that he had been forced to leave behind a wall of discipline, but who, on that day, had found a way through. The crowd had sensed this truth even before they could articulate it. She had absorbed it in a breath, in a shiver, in a silence that seemed to say, "We have just seen a man in all his complexity." Because the rules hadn't disappeared. They had not been erased. They were always there, solid, necessary, structuring. But they had momentarily stepped aside, not out of weakness, but with lucidity. Because sometimes respecting order is not just about applying the rule. It is recognizing the moment when the human being must prevail. The bulldog, with its round eyes and ragged breathing, was not an intrusion. It was a reminder that the world is not made up of perfect alignments, synchronized steps, and motionless swords. The world is full of surprises, of fragility, small lives that cross over into the big stages without understanding the stakes. And on that day, this little being had awakened something that no one expected to see. The tender, deep, intimate side of a guard whose entire life seemed to have been built to never show the slightest emotion. The officer himself understood, not in a smile, not in an explicit apology, but in the way he had measured his judgment, in this subtle but essential nuance between punishment and understanding. This nuance is something that only wise people can discern. This nuance only appears when a human decides to see another human. And in the crowd, this murmur has circulated like an invisible wave. The tourists, upon leaving, did not mention a guard who had broken protocol. They were talking about a gesture. In an instant, with emotion, they were talking about what they had felt, not what they had seen. Because ultimately, it wasn't the protocol that had made its mark that day. That was the contrast. The contrast between the rigidity of a world shaped by tradition and the unexpected gentleness of a furtive caress. Between authority and compassion. Between what needs to be done and what needs to be understood. There were no winners, no losers, no mistakes, no triumphs. Just a moment when the line between the role and the man became clear, like when a ray of sunlight pierces the clouds to hit only a specific point on the earth. Some will say it was nothing. A dog, a guard, a touch. 1 second. But it is precisely those seconds that sculpt the strongest memories. Those that remind us why we care about each other. Why do we stop? Why we watch? Why we seek what goes beyond the simple framework of our obligations. In a world where everything moves too fast, where faces pass without seeing each other, where responsibilities often mask vulnerability, this simple gesture has sparked something. A spark of truth, fragile yet indestructible. And this is the truth. A single gesture can sometimes tell the entire story of who we are, a strength contained within a tender heart, a discipline imbued with compassion, a rule softened by humanity. And now, those of you who have lived through this story, tell me, what everyday gesture, however small, has ever reminded you of the importance of being human? Leave your answer in the comments. Like this video if it touched you. Share it so others can experience this suspended moment. Subscribe to Guard Chrono, activate the bell, and remember, in a world of rules and barriers, sometimes a simple gesture is enough to reveal the true nature of a human being.